Norwegian mountains, February 1943. 6 British commandos lie motionless on a snow-covered hillside 50 yards from a German patrol route. They're setting up explosives to destroy a railway bridge critical to Nazi supply lines. But there's a problem. The snow stopped falling an hour ago, leaving clear visibility for miles. Any movement, any shadow, any unnatural shape will alert the guards. They should be completely exposed. They should be dead. But the German patrol walks past, boots crunching in the snow, so close the commandos can hear them talking about the cold. The guards scan the hillside carefully. They're experienced mountain troops, trained to spot irregularities in terrain. Their eyes pass directly over the British position. Nothing. They see nothing. Just snow-covered rocks and vegetation, exactly what should be there. The patrol moves on. 20 minutes later, the bridge explodes, and by the time German reinforcements arrive, the commandos have vanished into the wilderness like ghosts. What the Germans didn't see was a camouflage net so sophisticated, so perfectly designed that it could make 6 men and their equipment completely invisible at 50 yards in broad daylight. This wasn't ordinary netting painted green and brown. This was a technological marvel, woven from specially developed materials that matched not just color but texture, light reflection, and even thermal signature of surrounding terrain. It could transform a human shape into a boulder, a supply cache into a snowdrift, an entire sabotage team into empty landscape. Station 9 called it the environmental mimicry net. Commandos who used it called it the ghost blanket. The Germans called it Teufelsnetz, devil's net, because they knew British raiders were using something that made them functionally invisible, but they could never figure out how it worked or develop effective countermeasures. And the technology was so advanced, so carefully engineered, that modern military forces still use variants of the same principles today. But how do you make a net that doesn't just hide something, but makes it disappear completely? And why did this seemingly simple piece of fabric become one of the most requested items by every SOE and commando unit operating in occupied Europe? By 1941, British special operations faced a fundamental reconnaissance problem. German occupation forces were increasingly vigilant, with frequent patrols, observation posts, and sophisticated surveillance networks. Commandos and sabotage teams needed to remain hidden for hours or even days while conducting reconnaissance, setting up ambushes, or preparing demolitions. Traditional camouflage techniques, lying still, using natural cover, applying face paint, worked at distance but failed under close scrutiny. Standard military camouflage nets of the era were crude affairs, coarse netting dyed in mottled greens and browns, designed primarily to break up the outline of vehicles or artillery positions from aerial observation. They worked adequately for concealing static positions, but failed miserably for small teams operating in varied terrain. The colors rarely matched the actual environment. The uniform texture looked artificial. The netting cast distinctive shadows that human eyes instinctively recognized as unnatural. And they provided no concealment whatsoever against snow, desert, or rocky terrain. The SOE needed something revolutionary, not just better camouflage, but active concealment that could adapt to different environments, that could fool observers at close range, and that could be deployed rapidly by small teams under field conditions. Station 9's textile engineering team, led by a former theatrical set designer named Margaret Calvert and a material scientist named Dr. James Thornton, approached the problem from first principles. They studied how human vision detects objects, not just through color, but texture, shadow patterns, light reflection characteristics, and even thermal signature of surrounding terrain. It could transform a human shape into a boulder, a supply cache into a snowdrift, an entire sabotage team into empty landscape. They analyzed photographs of various terrain types, identifying the specific visual signatures that made landscapes look natural versus artificial. And they experimented with hundreds of material combinations, seeking fibers and weaving techniques that could replicate natural environmental characteristics. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: film industry techniques. Calvert had worked in theater and understood how stage scenery created convincing illusions through layered textures and careful light management. She proposed a multi-layer net system with different materials at different depths, each layer contributing to the overall illusion. Thornton provided the material science, developing custom fibers with specific light reflection properties and thermal characteristics. The result was unlike any camouflage net before or since. It didn't just conceal, it actively mimicked the visual, textural, and even thermal properties of natural terrain. And it would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of British special operations, a piece of technology so effective that Station 9 produced thousands of square yards of it despite the enormous manufacturing complexity. This is the story of how British engineers created camouflage so perfect it seemed like magic, and how it saved countless lives in the frozen mountains, dense forests, and hostile deserts where Britain's secret warriors operated. The environmental mimicry net wasn't a single product, but a system of specialized variants, each optimized for specific terrain types. Station 9 eventually developed 7 primary versions: temperate forest, winter snow, desert sand, rocky mountain, grassland, urban rubble, and coastal marsh. Each variant used different materials, colors, and construction techniques tailored to its intended environment. The basic structure consisted of 3 integrated layers. The base layer was an ultra-fine mesh woven from silk or later synthetic fibers, dyed to match the predominant color of the target environment. This layer was nearly transparent at close range, but provided the foundational color tone. The middle layer used irregular strips of specially treated fabric in varying shades. For forest versions, multiple greens and browns. For snow, whites and pale grays with subtle blue undertones. These strips were attached at random intervals and orientations, creating texture and depth. The outer layer incorporated 3-dimensional elements: artificial foliage for forest nets, lichen-textured patches for rock environments, or sculpted fabric forms that mimicked snowdrifts or desert sand patterns. The materials were extraordinary. Dr. Thornton developed custom-dyed fibers that didn't just match colors, but replicated the light reflection properties of natural materials. Forest leaves have a subtle sheen from their waxy coating. The fabric strips mimicked this. Snow has crystalline light-scattering properties. The white fabrics were treated with microscopic glass particles that produced similar effects. Desert sand reflects light differently at different angles due to its granular structure. The desert net fabrics incorporated texture patterns that approximated this characteristic. Thermal properties were equally important. Human bodies radiate heat, creating thermal signatures visible to anyone who's learned to spot them. German mountain troops were particularly skilled at this. Station 9's nets incorporated thin layers of insulating material that disrupted heat signatures without adding excessive weight. The insulation didn't block heat entirely. That would create a cold spot equally suspicious, but diffused it to match the ambient thermal patterns of surrounding terrain. The attachment system was brilliantly simple. The nets came with lightweight aluminum stakes and adjustable cord systems that allowed rapid deployment. More importantly, they included attachment points for incorporating actual natural materials from the environment. Soldiers could weave in branches, grass, snow, or rocks to further blend the net with surroundings. This customization capability meant the nets could adapt to microenvironments within their general terrain category. Size options ranged from individual concealment blankets measuring 6 by 8 feet to large team nets spanning 20 by 30 feet. Individual blankets weighed approximately 3 to 4 pounds and could be carried in a standard pack. Team nets required distribution among multiple personnel, but provided concealment for entire squads plus equipment. All versions packed down to relatively compact bundles. The multi-layer construction was designed to compress efficiently. You won't believe the testing process Station 9 used to validate these nets. They set up observation experiments where trained spotters, including German prisoners of war familiar with Wehrmacht reconnaissance techniques, attempted to detect concealed personnel at various ranges. The nets consistently defeated detection down to 30 yards, and even at 20 yards, observers usually reported seeing something that might be suspicious, rather than clearly identifying concealed humans. Photographic tests showed the nets were equally effective against aerial observation. The manufacturing process was incredibly labor-intensive. Each net required skilled textile workers to hand-weave the 3 layers, dye and treat the materials, and attach the 3-dimensional elements in patterns irregular enough to appear natural. A single team-sized net took approximately 40 hours of skilled labor to produce. This limited production capacity became a persistent bottleneck. Demand always exceeded supply. Station 9 established a dedicated textile workshop in late 1941, employing primarily women with experience in garment manufacturing, theater costume design, or textile arts. At peak production, the facility employed over 60 workers and produced approximately 200 individual nets per month, nowhere near enough to meet operational demand from commando units, SOE teams, and resistance groups across multiple theaters. The materials themselves created supply challenges. The custom-dyed fibers required specific chemical treatments, some using materials that were also needed for other war production. The glass microparticles used in snow nets came from a single supplier who was also supporting aviation instrument manufacturing. Priority allocations had to be negotiated constantly. The insulating materials were derived from experimental synthetic fibers, essentially very early versions of what would later become commercial synthetic fabrics, and production quantities were limited. Quality control was rigorous. Each completed net underwent photographic testing against sample backgrounds matching its intended environment. Nets that didn't meet Station 9's exacting standards were rejected. Typically 15 to 20% of production failed quality checks. The rejected nets were sometimes issued to training units for practice, but never deployed operationally. This quality control rigor meant that nets reaching the field were extraordinarily effective, but it further reduced already limited supply. Distribution prioritization became contentious. Commando units conducting raids in Norway desperately needed snow nets. SOE teams in France required forest versions. Special forces in North Africa demanded desert variants. All requests were legitimate, all operations were critical, and there was never enough to go around. The allocation system gave priority to missions judged most strategically significant, or where concealment failure would likely result in complete mission failure and loss of personnel. The nets were classified top secret, even higher than many weapons systems. Operatives receiving them were briefed that the nets were experimental technology that must be protected from capture. If a mission went wrong and extraction became impossible, standing orders were to destroy the nets rather than allow German recovery. Several commandos reported burning their nets during hasty retreats, watching valuable equipment go up in flames to prevent German intelligence services from analyzing the technology. Training on net deployment was essential. Simply throwing the net over personnel didn't work. That created an obvious artificial mound. Operators learned to position the net to follow natural terrain contours, to anchor it properly to prevent wind movement, to integrate natural materials, and to create shadow patterns that matched surrounding features. Well-deployed nets were virtually undetectable. Poorly deployed nets might as well not exist. Training emphasized patience. Taking 5 minutes to deploy the net perfectly was infinitely better than rushing and creating a detectable position.
Field maintenance was another consideration. The nets were durable, but not indestructible. Tears compromised effectiveness. Dirt accumulation changed color and reflection properties. Station 9 provided repair kits with replacement fabric patches and dye sticks for field touch-ups. Operatives were trained in basic textile repair techniques, skills most male soldiers had never needed before but proved essential for maintaining their primary survival tool. But theoretical brilliance and successful testing meant nothing without proven performance in actual operations. How did these extraordinary nets function when real commandos used them in life-or-death situations against real German forces? The first major operational success occurred during Operation Archery, the Vagsø raid in Norway, December 1941. British commandos used early production snow nets to conceal observation posts overlooking German positions for 12 hours before the assault. German patrols passed within 40 yards of concealed British positions multiple times. Post-raid interrogations of captured German soldiers revealed they'd been completely unaware of the observation posts despite conducting standard security sweeps of the area. In France, resistance groups used forest nets extensively for ambush operations against German convoys. A typical operation might involve positioning a team alongside a road hours before the convoy's expected arrival, concealed under nets that made them indistinguishable from the forest edge. The Germans, even when specifically warned about partisan activity in an area, consistently failed to detect concealed positions. After-action reports from resistance fighters repeatedly praised the nets as their most valuable equipment after weapons themselves. One particularly dramatic incident occurred in the French Alps, summer 1943. An SOE team conducting reconnaissance on a German mountain fortification spent 3 days concealed under rocky mountain nets less than 100 yards from the fortification. German soldiers walked past their position multiple times. At one point, 2 German sentries actually sat on rocks immediately adjacent to the concealed British position, smoking cigarettes and talking for 20 minutes before continuing their patrol. The SOE team remained motionless under the net for the entire duration, barely breathing, listening to the guards discuss mundane topics while sitting literally within touching distance. The reconnaissance intelligence gathered during those 3 days enabled a subsequent commando raid that destroyed the fortification. Desert operations in North Africa saw equally impressive results. SAS patrols used desert nets to conceal their vehicles and personnel during daylight hours while conducting reconnaissance deep behind German lines. The nets proved effective not just against ground observation, but against German aerial reconnaissance. Luftwaffe pilots reported open desert where British patrols were actually concealed. One SAS patrol spent 5 days within 2 miles of a German airfield, concealed under desert nets during the day and conducting sabotage operations at night. They destroyed 12 aircraft before extracting successfully, and German investigations never determined where the raiders hidden during daylight hours. Not all uses involved military operations. In Denmark, resistance fighters used urban rebel nets to conceal weapons caches in bombed buildings. The nets made piles of concealed weapons look identical to surrounding rebel, defeating German searches. One cache concealed under nets sat undiscovered for 18 months, despite German troops using the same bombed building as an observation post. The Germans were literally standing on a camouflaged weapons cache containing rifles, explosives, and ammunition for 200 resistance fighters, and never suspected its presence. There were also close calls that demonstrated the net's limitations. In one incident, a British patrol in Norway was concealed under snow nets when a German soldier literally stepped on one commando's leg while crossing rough terrain. The net had concealed them visually, but physical contact obviously revealed their presence. A firefight erupted, and 2 commandos were wounded before the team could disengage. The lesson reinforced training protocols. The nets provided visual concealment, not physical protection, and positioning had to account for the possibility of enemy personnel moving through the concealed area. Another limitation appeared during a mission in France when changing light conditions compromised a forest net's effectiveness. The net had been deployed during overcast morning conditions. When the sun broke through clouds in the afternoon, the changed lighting revealed texture mismatches between the net and surrounding forest. A German patrol noticed the anomaly and investigated, discovering the concealed British position. The team escaped, but the incident led to improved training on repositioning nets when lighting conditions changed significantly. Weather could also compromise effectiveness.
Heavy rain would flatten three-dimensional elements on some net types, reducing their texture matching capability. Strong winds could lift or shift nets, creating movement that drew attention. Snow accumulation on winter nets was generally beneficial. Adding natural material improved concealment, but ice formation could create unnatural reflective surfaces. Operatives learned to adapt to these conditions, sometimes adding or removing material to maintain the illusion under changing weather. Little did the commandos know, German intelligence was desperately trying to understand and counter the British camouflage technology, but would consistently fail to grasp its true sophistication. The Germans knew British forces possessed superior camouflage capability. Captured commandos sometimes carried pieces of the nets, and German after-action reports repeatedly mentioned British raiders appearing to materialize from empty terrain. But German understanding remained fragmentary. They recovered damaged net sections, analyzed the materials, and studied the construction. Their conclusions were partially correct, but missed critical elements. German textile analysis identified the multi-layer construction and the custom-dyed fibers, but they assumed the effectiveness came primarily from superior dye chemistry rather than understanding the holistic design philosophy of mimicking multiple visual properties simultaneously. Their attempts to replicate the technology produced improved camouflage nets by German standards, but nothing approaching the effectiveness of British versions. German copies used simpler construction, fewer layers, and conventional materials with better coloring, an incremental improvement over existing German nets, but not a revolutionary advance. The Germans also failed to appreciate the specialization for terrain types. They tried to create universal camouflage solutions rather than environment-specific systems. This approach reflected their operational doctrine. German forces expected to operate across varied terrain and wanted equipment that worked everywhere adequately rather than exceptionally in specific environments. British doctrine was opposite. Small, specialized teams operating in chosen terrain, equipped with optimal tools for that specific environment. German counter-surveillance techniques evolved in response to the perceived British camouflage advantage. They increased patrol frequencies, used trained dogs to detect concealed personnel by scent rather than vision, and implemented more thorough terrain searches. These measures were somewhat effective, but resource-intensive. A thorough search that might detect concealed British positions took hours and diverted troops from other duties. The Germans couldn't maintain that level of vigilance everywhere, so British teams simply operated in areas where surveillance was less intense. Some German units developed specialized training in spotting concealed positions, teaching soldiers to look for secondary indicators, disturbed ground, unnatural shadows, thermal anomalies visible to trained eyes. These trained observers achieved somewhat better detection rates, but were never consistently successful. The problem was fundamental. The British nets were designed specifically to defeat all the visual cues these observers were trained to spot. German technical intelligence services issued several reports on British camouflage technology, noting its sophisticated design and recommending development of comparable systems. But by 1943-44, German industrial capacity was increasingly strained. Developing advanced camouflage nets was low priority compared to producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Some experimental German nets with improved characteristics were produced in small numbers, but never achieved wide distribution. Ironically, the German failure to replicate British camouflage technology stemmed partly from underestimating its importance. German doctrine emphasized mobility, firepower, and aggressive tactics. Camouflage was viewed as a defensive measure, somewhat passive, less important than offensive capabilities. The British, operating from a position of comparative weakness in occupied territory, had inverted that logic. Concealment was offensive capability, the tool that enabled small teams to achieve effects far beyond their size. This philosophical difference meant Germans never invested the resources into camouflage technology that might have produced equivalent results. Field feedback drove continuous improvement in net design throughout the war. Operatives requested lighter materials. Station 9 developed thinner fabrics that maintained effectiveness while reducing weight by approximately 30%. Users needed faster deployment.
Simplified attachment systems cut setup time from 5 minutes to under 3. Durability complaints led to reinforced stress points that extended net lifespan under field conditions. The most significant evolution was the development of reversible nets. Late war versions featured different camouflage patterns on each side. A forest net might have snow camouflage on the reverse, allowing teams to adapt to changing terrain without carrying multiple nets. This innovation roughly doubled the effective utility of each net, while only marginally increasing weight and bulk. Station 9 also developed specialized variants for specific mission types. Sniper screens were smaller, more portable nets designed for individual marksmen. Cache covers were larger, heavier-duty versions for concealing supply dumps or equipment caches for extended periods. Urban infiltration nets mimicked building rubble, broken walls, or debris piles for operations in bombed cities. After World War II, the technology didn't disappear. It evolved into modern military camouflage systems. The multi-layer approach, the emphasis on matching multiple visual properties, the concept of terrain-specific variants all became standard practice in camouflage design. Modern ghillie suits used by snipers and reconnaissance specialists are direct descendants of Station 9's environmental mimicry nets, using the same principles of layered construction and three-dimensional texture. The thermal disruption technology pioneered in the nets influenced post-war development of thermal camouflage for vehicles and installations. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces invested heavily in defeating thermal imaging, building on principles originally developed for Station 9's nets. Modern multispectral camouflage systems, designed to defeat visual, infrared, and radar detection simultaneously, represent the logical extension of the holistic design approach Station 9 pioneered. British Special Forces continued using variants of the original nets through the 1950s and 1960s. SAS operations in Malaya, Borneo, and Oman employed descendants of World War II technology. As synthetic materials improved, nets became lighter and more durable, but the fundamental design principles remained unchanged. Some modern British military units still use camouflage systems that would be recognizable to World War II commandos, updated with contemporary materials, but conceptually identical. The textile engineering techniques developed for the nets influenced civilian applications as well. Margaret Calvert, the theatrical designer who co-developed the original nets, went on to design Britain's motorway signage system after the war. Her understanding of how visual perception works at distance under varied lighting conditions, learned developing camouflage, proved valuable in creating effective road signs. The materials science advances led by Dr. Thornton contributed to post-war textile industry developments in synthetic fibers and specialized fabric treatments. Perhaps the most lasting legacy is philosophical, the demonstration that sometimes the most effective military technology isn't the most powerful, but the most clever. The environmental mimicry nets didn't destroy anything, didn't kill anyone directly, didn't win battles through firepower. They enabled small teams to operate where they shouldn't be able to survive, to observe what they shouldn't be able to see, to strike where they shouldn't be able to reach. That capability, multiplied across hundreds of operations, contributed significantly to Allied success in ways that are impossible to quantify, but undeniably real. The environmental mimicry net was never flashy. It didn't explode, shoot, or destroy. It simply made people invisible when visibility meant death. But in the brutal arithmetic of special operations, where success often depends on remaining undetected until the critical moment, invisibility is perhaps the most powerful capability of all. British engineers understood this, and they created camouflage so sophisticated it seemed like impossible magic to everyone who encountered it, including the enemy who could never quite figure out how it worked. The next time you see military camouflage, remember that there's a lineage of innovation stretching back to Station 9's workshops, where dedicated engineers and textile workers hand-wove nets that saved thousands of lives by making soldiers disappear into snow, forest, and desert.
Those weird camouflage nets weren't just fabric, they were invisible armor, the technology that turned humans into ghosts and enabled Britain's secret warriors to operate in the shadows where conventional forces couldn't survive. If these stories of brilliant British innovation have captivated you, you absolutely need to watch our previous videos right now. Discover the poison rings that gave captured agents one final terrible choice in Gestapo dungeons. Learn about the silent wire cutters that sliced through Nazi fences without making a sound, enabling countless raids and sabotage operations. Explore the L-delay sleeper explosives that waited months before detonating, destroying German equipment long after saboteurs had vanished. See the thermite incendiaries that burned so hot they melted steel and turned ammunition dumps into infernos. And don't miss the well-rod pistol, the suppressed assassin that killed Nazi officers in absolute silence. Every single one of these weapons and tools shares the same thread: British ingenuity transforming desperate necessity into deadly advantage through clever engineering and relentless innovation. These are the secret weapons that won World War II, the tools that operated in the shadows and changed history without fanfare or recognition. Subscribe to this channel right now to discover more forgotten innovations that helped defeat the Third Reich. Hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering the brilliant, weird, and absolutely ingenious technology that won the war through cleverness rather than firepower, and you won't want to miss a single story of the engineers, soldiers, and resistance fighters who proved that sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy never sees coming.